Well, dear viewer, I have one simple question for you. How's a video game made? That's a question that we gamers rarely think about, but a lot of times we insist we know the answer. As gamers, we rarely think about this process, and if we're being honest, most of us haven't really explored this process of how it works if we even care. We just think, hey, someone has a great idea for a game, let's get some money, let's get some developers, some artists, maybe some voice actors, get a publisher, throw it all in a pot, and then boom, we have a game. We have Jedi Fallen Order. Boom, it's just here, out of nowhere. Or maybe you even think that it's like a recipe, where you add some developers, add a pinch of money, a dash of salt, and suddenly we throw it in the oven. Takes about 2 to 4 years to bake. Boom, game. We now have the Outer Worlds. We pretty much know that that's not how that works, not at all. But with all these announcements of games being delayed until later this year, or even in the case of Dying Light, delayed indefinitely, I thought I would investigate the game making process to see what this actually entails, what happens on a general basis, how this goes from I have an idea to I have a game here sitting in my hand. Now, bear in mind that this is going to be a flyover of the entire process, that this is going to be the 30,000-foot view of the game making process. And this will also vary from studio to studio. However, the broad points will hold true in the entire process. After the announcement of Cyberpunk 2077 being delayed until September because of optimization issues, many took to social media to voice their displeasure. Now, this is the second time that the game has been delayed in recent history. So many people were less than thrilled that this would actually happen and that it's affecting them personally. Like, this game is something they absolutely need in their lives, not something that they want in their lives. So they took their anger to Twitter, to social media, and voiced this in a less than tactful way. There are many comments out there that I'd rather not post on my channel because I don't need to have any issues from YouTube about derogatory language. We can all use our imaginations and really figure out what people were actually saying. With all this swirling around, all this negativity, heading straight to CDPR and Cyberpunk 2077, Cody Barlog came to the defense of the development process. He said, games are very ugly for a long time until they're not. Traditionally, that is right near the end. We never stop to think about the level of coding, the amount of coding involved in just making a bullet fly across the map and act like it would in real life. How it could go through a glass pane, but it can't go through a brick wall. You need to code all of that. You need to figure out how to code that if you're making it a realistic shooter, the bullet will drop over time. There will be an arc to it. You need to put all that process in. There are a lot of moving parts, no pun intended, that you have to consider before it actually goes together and works. And you think, hey, all right, I got this chunk of code right here for a bullet that flies. Now it has to interact with this chunk of code that is how the gun fires. And maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. Then you got to go back, you got to tweak, you got to change things. It's a long, involved process. Many games are insanely complex with tons and tons of moving pieces. As the years rolled on, these things get more and more complex. Just look at way back in the late 80s, the dumpster fire that was E.T. the game. As a side note, this was cited as one of the major contributing factors of the video game collapse in the late 80s. Now, only one person created this game, and it was only in a handful of weeks, compared to how things are created today, where you could have dozens or hundreds of developers and programmers and designers that take a handful of years to complete. Now, none of the games, no matter how good or bad they are, have tried to lead to a video game collapse, much like E.T. did. So, I think it's going to be a helpful process here to watch and to really find out how video games as a whole are made. I think shedding a little bit of light here on this development process is going to open up some people's eyes and hopefully give them some understanding as to why things happen the way they do, why games kind of get delayed, and what can happen in a day-to-day or month-to-month process here in video games. Now, before we get too far into this video, if you like what you've seen so far, maybe think about subscribing and hitting that bell for notifications. And now, without further ado, here's the rest of your video. So before we get too far into this, we need to clear up a few things and throw out a few definitions here. Game development and game design are two different things. However, game design falls under the game development umbrella. Just like every square is a rectangle, but not every rectangle is a square. So, let's just keep this in mind that in a smaller game studio, you can be a developer and designer. Typically, the smaller the team, the more roles you have. The larger the team, the more specific your role is. So on a smaller team, you might be the person in charge of creating the entire environment. On a larger team, you might be in charge of only one or two aspects, maybe making 3 or 4 NPCs that the player interacts with. Now, game design is the idea of the game. This is thought of as the concept of the game. This is the concept phase where ideas are fleshed out. You're spitballing ideas. You're like, hey, would this be cool? What about this? This is where some basic mechanics and the overall visual theme of the game, the characters, the level design, and stories are all discussed. This is all in a general, broad outline format. There's nothing real specific on this. It'd be, hey, wouldn't it be cool to have a space game where we're going to Mars and setting up a new base and talking about how to create a colony on Mars? Boom, we now have Surviving Mars. That's along the lines of how something like this would happen. When you talk about game development, this is where the coding comes into play, along with rendering, testing, and adding all those other little bits and bobs like character models and sound design. In a nutshell, this is the basic distinction between game design and game development. Design is just the idea. You're coming up with a broad concept of what you want to make. Game development is actually putting the rubber to the road. You're making whatever this game is supposed to be. Now that we have some of these basic definitions out of the way, we can go into the general steps of game development. The first step is the idea phase, which I've just talked about here. This is where you can create your idea. You can refine it down into the essence of the game. This should only be a couple sentences long. This is your elevator pitch. This is, hey, I just ran into Cody Barlog, and I have this great idea for a game. We're on an elevator. We're only going up 10 floors, and I need to sell him on this. This is, here it is. Boom, boom, boom. What do you think? Can we set up a meeting? Yay or nay? Most likely a nay. That's just my personal opinion there. But most likely that's not going to work, but this is what it should be. You should, as you're trying to pitch this to your friends, to developers, to studios, this should be your quick, like, hey, I got this idea, boom, here it is. And then you'll have to flesh that out. So unless you want to self-publish and work on your own, this next step is definitely a huge one. This is where you actually pitch your idea. You need to present your idea to either the rest of your development team or to a publisher, depending on how you're set up, how your studio is set up, and what's kind of going on with your present situation. The most important thing here is to keep it concise. You don't want to get into the nitty-gritty. You don't need to say that the leaves on this tree are going to blow in this manner and that they're going to be this exact shade of green. Nobody cares. People will tune out, they will turn off, and you'll get shot down. They want to know why this game should exist. They want to have an engaging experience with you as you try to present your idea and convince them it's your idea. You love the idea. You think that this is the greatest thing in the world. You need to convey that to them and convince them that this is also the greatest idea in the world and that they should give you millions of dollars to develop it. This presentation should come out as engaging with hitting the highlights, hitting the major story beats of this will happen, this is what the call to action is, this is the rise, and this is the payoff, this is the conclusion, with some general ideas of mechanics. Is it going to be an RPG? Is it going to be an FPS? Is it a strategy game? Are we talking like Gears of War, or are we talking Civ 6? These are important things to know and to convey that the general mechanics are, hey, it's a turn-based strategy game, that we're going to do this and that and the other thing. What you really want to hammer home is why this game needs to be made right now, why you need this money right now, and this game, when it hits, will be a financial and commercial success. Regardless of what you think of any flops that have been put out there by any big game companies, they initially thought that this was going to be a good idea. Whether it was the story that wasn't well or the marketing that wasn't well, they initially thought that this was going to be a commercial and financial success. So you're also going to have to be prepared to field a whole bunch of difficult questions. So you better be on your toes. You better have researched what you want and really know your presentation inside and out, because any fumble, any stumble along the way is going to lead to doubt in your investors, in the studio, in the other developers, and they're not going to be sold on this. Now we're into the next phase, and we assume that the studio really loved your pitch, that they want you to go ahead and travel along your way to the merry magical land of conceptualization. This is where things start to pick up at a ever-increasing pace. At this point, you must outline your entire game. Before, you had the bullet points. You had your A, B, C, D. Boom, this happens, then this happens, then this happens, and then this is the end. That's it. Now you have to have A1, A2, A3, maybe even A12B, A12C, so on and so forth, all the way down the line. You really need to flesh out all the details of your story. You need to flesh out all the details of your characters and all the other important aspects of your game. You don't necessarily need to write any dialogue at this point, but you need to know where the story is going. You need to know that if X happens, character B is going to react in this way, character C will then act in this way, and character F will punch them both in the face because they're all stupid. You need to know what's going to happen in all of these scenarios. You need to get in the mindset of your characters and understand where they're coming from. This will give you a much better developed game, better developed characters. You also need to start looking at risk analysis. What happens if this game fails? What happens if people don't like this certain part? How will this affect that? You need to look at your target demographic. Are you looking at teenage boys? Are you looking at middle-aged gamers as a whole? Is this going to be something you're hoping that people will want to stream on Twitch? Or is this a competitive game? Are you trying to start up a new competitive scene? Are you trying to make the next Overwatch? What are your ideas with this? All this fun paperwork then leads you to the next and more entertaining part. I use entertaining loosely here. This is the part of production. This is where you create the game design document. This is where all the fun paperwork happens. Trust me, everybody loves paperwork. But if you have great documentation, if you have a great design document, there'll be less questions, there'll be less revisions later if you put in the work on the front end, so there is less confusion for people on the back end. Now, this includes everything tied to the gameplay, and you even prototype parts of the game, where you want to show this is what happens, this is what this is going to look like. Now, it's not going to be the prettiest, it's not going to be the smoothest running thing, but it will convey the idea in a tangible sense rather than trying to paint a picture in your mind. There's a picture on the screen right now showing you this is what I want it to look like, this is what I want it to play like. This goes hand in hand with the next step, the prototype phase. Yes, I said we prototype parts of the game, now we're prototyping the game. This phase allows you to develop methods to fully implement your idea. Think of this as laying the foundation of a house. If you take your time and put in all the work and really pay attention to the details of the foundation of your house, the rest of the process is going to go so smooth. But if you create a foundation that isn't very solid, that it isn't very robust, your house is going to sink, it's going to fall, it's not going to survive very long. It could get condemned. You could end up in development hell and just never work your way out of it. If you try to cut corners here, you're just going to create more work down the line. It's going to come back and bite you in the butt. This stage, this full prototype, does give you a proof of concept. This shows any flaws or areas that you need to revamp, areas that you might not have considered before that weren't apparent in any of the documentation that you did, but now upon seeing it, you realize that this idea kind of works, but we need to tweak this part here and there. This is the last thing you want to do before you move out into full-blown production. Now, production can break down into 3 different major sub-areas: design, level creation, and programming. Let's not forget that this is still a broad overview of the game-making process, and each of these steps can take months or years to complete, depending on the scope and complexity of your game. Now, there are these 3 major areas, but they're all broken down into little different areas. Now, each of these areas, the design, level creation, and programming, can break down into further and further smaller areas, but that is outside the scope of what this video is trying to be. Now, with programming, there are a variety of languages you can learn out there. The most important thing is to pick a language that fits your style and how you learn. Unless there is some mandate at your company, you're kind of free to do your own thing here. Now, they all will get you to the same end. They will still give you the same end product that you want. You just need to make sure that you pick one that makes sense to you. Generally speaking, the 4 most common languages are C++, Java, HTML5, and JavaScript. The big thing to remember, in a bigger studio like, say, a Bethesda or a Ubisoft, you're part of a team. You might oversee the creation of a handful of NPCs or just a field. It's not uncommon to see developers specialize in specific areas, especially when they work in a large AAA studio. You want to be known as the guy who creates the best trees out there, because everybody needs trees in their games. So you want to do the best that you can and show your value there, and maybe even get another job somewhere else doing the same thing, or maybe even move up the ranks. Depending on the size of your studio, again, the bigger the studio, the more specialized that you are. The smaller studio, the broader your scope is. It's important to know that a lot of these studios never stop working. Take Ubisoft, for example. They have 30 studios around the world. Much like the British Empire of old, the sun never sets on the Ubisoft empire. Alexandre Parizeau said, "The technical way of working 24/7 is something we've perfected over the years. Developers are in constant communication with other developers out there. They're using Skype and other ways to communicate with developers all around the world. Typically, one studio becomes the de facto head of a project. They become the lead on a project, much like the Toronto studio of Ubisoft took the lead on the Far Cry franchise. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just how things work. It's important to know that game developers are always in demand at the rate that these studios are constantly churning out games, not including all of the smaller developers. This is just the AAA space. Every year we get a new Call of Duty game. Every single year. And for a long time, we got a new Assassin's Creed game. Now, they've slowed down the production there, but they still need a lot of people there. The entire process of creating a video game is a long, hectic process that few of us ever grasp. We don't fully understand the details of this complex process, and I'm sure there's variability from studio to studio, even within the same company. But I hope this has shed a little bit of light on the process. As gamers, we often have a sense of entitlement, and we get mad when a studio delays a game, and we're furious if it releases in a buggy mess. It always seems like there's no way to please us. We just have to remember that a delayed game can be a good game, while a buggy game will always be remembered as a bad game. I think Cody Barlog summed it up the best when, in his tweet thread, the last tweet that he sent out, he said, "We all obviously want to release the smoothest, most bug-free experience humanly possible. Sometimes we mostly succeed. Sometimes we don't. But it is never because we did not try." I think what we have to remember here is that they are trying. Nobody wants to put out a flop. Nobody wants to put their name on a bad game. We need to remember that these developers are trying their best They're doing what they can with what they have. They're putting in long hours to make a game that is good for you. If you're looking for an amazing article from a game designer, Polygon has a great article. I'll have a link in the description below. Jennifer Shirley shares some great details and personal perspective on how the video game development process works. How one person can tweak the health and defense numbers for hours on end to make a game so much better. Much like the sentiment that was expressed by Cody Barlog, she says, "We have to believe that you will love it, because otherwise, where have the past 3 to 8 years gone?" We should try to remember that no matter how much we like or hate a game, no matter how good or bad we think it really is, people have spent a large chunk of their lives working on it. Just think, if this is your first job out of college, you've now spent up to 8 years, if not more, working on one game. That's a lot of time and investment here. I think we need to take a step back, take a breath. Yes, we can be disappointed. I've expressed that sentiment before. I was disappointed when Doom was pushed back. I think that is a perfectly reasonable response. We can get a little bummed because we're excited to see a game. We're excited to see their hard work. But when they say, hey, we need a little more time to put another coat of polish on this, to really make this the best experience for you that we possibly can, I'm okay with that. I think what CD Projekt Red delaying Cyberpunk until September is doing, they're trying to optimize, they're trying to make it better. They understand that they want to give you the best experience possible. And I think we just need to remember this. They're not trying to screw you over. There's no hidden intent. There's no ulterior motive. It's just they want to make the best game possible. So I think we need to keep that in mind when we hear the next delay of our next favorite game. Take a breath, realize that these people need a little more time. That this idea needs to be processed just a little bit longer to give you the best experience possible. I hope this video helped explain a little bit of what's going on there with this development process. If you like this video, give us a big old thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell for notifications. We come out with new content all the time. Thanks for watching, and I can't wait to see you all in the next video. Don't forget that a little bit of self-care can go a long way. Take care of yourself both mentally and physically.